So call it defiance, non-compliance, cast us hellbound, demonize us, do whatever you have to do to keep us quiet. We just refuse to be miswritten, misspoken on, reliant on, or indicted on misconstrued versions of the truth. So broadcast this. It's what your anchor man missed. We are limitless, plucked wings that still manage to fly, ex-mental prisoners of someone else's expectations. Our brains and our bodies were never meant to be beaten into submission to temper fearful dispositions. Our strength holds the stars in place. It takes the night to mold soldiers, and we are eternal warriors, audacious dancers, the deepest of lovers. We are your fathers, your sons, your sisters, and your brothers. We are your teachers, leaders, keepers of cultural secrets, possibilities, and opportunities. So we decided to speak in our honor, in our celebration, speak over love, speak out of history, to speak into existence the real of our resilience, highlight our brilliance, to come to the understanding that we are all the same children of this world we live in, and as we have not left you, you will not leave us. So we decided to not be silent, to reach into our throats for the words that shouldn't have to be said, to offer our character to be caretakers of our own narrative, to craft content contrary to convoluted constructs, ensuring that our history is being told and in our own language. We can no longer apologize for fighting for the freedom in our walk, or stand still while our bodies are being moved in the direction of mischaracterization. Because it's time for the world to acknowledge that our lives have and always will matter. On this, we decided. Go get it! So I chose to, I got you, thank you. I chose to start today's talk with spoken word poetry because it's perhaps the most effective way to be able to introduce myself as a spoken word artist and as a space maker. I admittedly have never performed poetry with the words behind me, so if they were off, you're all right, it's fine, you still got the poem, but I was trying to do y'all a favor. So if it was on, great, if it was off, great. But long before I joined the team at Mass, even before I started studying architecture, I was already interested in understanding how public space could be reclaimed to amplify ignored voices, and I chose poetry as my medium to do so. And I'm going to pause to acknowledge Ezra, who's looking for me. It's okay, Bubbas. Mama's right here, you can see me, but you can't come up on the stage with me, okay? Because I don't have anywhere to sit. It's all right. Here, you want to go outside for a little while and then come back? Go with mommy. Yes. No. 10 minutes ago, he was all, like, she was all he wanted, and now he's like, no, you're doing important things. So, but anyway, so additionally, I wanted to share that poem because I felt like that poem, which is titled We Decided, speaks to some of the themes that are in our work that I'm excited to share with you all today by way of 3 projects. And I offer this poem and this lecture as an introduction to the Public Memory and Memorials Lab, but I'm doing so today through the lens of labor, land, and memory. So of course I have to begin with just a little bit of gratitude before I get into some things. I want to thank Tatiana and Jermaine for inviting me to be here, and I want to thank you all for welcoming me, my wife, and my whining son. I try my hardest not to travel without the 2 of them because I am whole when they are with me, and I never want to give you just a piece of me. So there are 3 projects today that I'm going to share with you. The first 2 are in-progress projects within the Public Memory and Memorials Lab portfolio. The first of which speaks to legacies of labor extracted through convict leasing in Texas. The second comprises 2 projects that honor the 1965 Voting Rights March and speak to the land and labor that went into the transformative Landmark Association for Collective Agency. And the third is a transformative completed project in Rwanda that, in full transparency, is not one that I have worked on, but it was just too aligned with this year's theme for me not to share. So when we get to the questions, if I can't answer it, I'm going to tag in my colleague, Christian Binamana. I'm so grateful he is here because he will be able to answer questions alongside me for that particular project. And while it's not a project that I am necessarily sharing today, I would be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge that so much of what we're learning in the Public Memory and Memorials Lab is built off of what we learned and what we processed through the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is in Montgomery, Alabama, opened in 2018, and is the only national monument in the United States that acknowledges and addresses racial terror lynchings in our country. Yes. So, a little bit about MASS. MASS is an acronym that stands for Model of Architecture Serving Society, and was founded on the understanding that architecture's influence reaches beyond individual buildings. We, as a collective of designers, believe that architecture has a critical role to play in supporting communities to confront history, shape new narratives, collectively heal, and project new possibilities for the future. We are a team of over 120 architects, landscape architects, engineers, builders, furniture designers, writers, filmmakers, researchers, you name it, we probably have somebody on our team that can do it, and we are representing over 20 countries, by far the most diverse firm I have ever worked with and for in my architecture career. And we are incorporated as a nonprofit organization, so we are uniquely positioned to leverage philanthropy, ensuring that we can serve communities in need. And in addition to full architecture services, we are able to work with partners very early on in their stages to help assist with defining their mission and setting their ambitions. Some of our work can be categorized through a series of design labs that aim to focus research and project partners around key topics where we feel that design can be a unique contributor to advancing justice. And so I am going to talk to you all specifically about the Public Memory and Memorials Lab today, but we have a Restorative Justice Design Lab, a Fringe Cities Lab, Deaf Space and Disability Justice Lab, and Sustainable Native Communities Lab, excuse me. I'm also going to briefly today touch on the Abundant Futures Lab. It's one of our newer labs, but also very much aligned with what we're talking about here today, so I'll give you all a little bit of information about that. Since our founding, we've had a number of opportunities to work on projects that provoke radical truth-telling and ways to shift public narratives, including those that grapple with the Rwandan genocide and racial terror lynchings in the United States. Recognizing the urgency and impact of this work, our philanthropic partners provided dedicated support to launch our Public Memory and Memorials Lab in 2019, of which I am the director and principal. Yes, it is stressful. We will talk about that at dinner. So a little bit about the lab. It is rooted in several principles, and it is thought about how we understand that we all tell ourselves stories through built forms, whether it's monuments, museums, landmarks, place names, and more. And these stories matter. For centuries, public memory has been a vehicle for propaganda, education, and celebration. Across the globe, these sites of memory are very selective, giving weight to particular narratives while completely erasing others. In the United States, for example, public memory has intentionally been shaped through white supremacy ideology, reinforcing power structures through sites like Confederate monuments and biased archival collections. And in 2021, the Monument Lab published a national monument audit of over 50,000 monuments with several key findings, one being that the story of the United States as told by our current monument landscape woefully misrepresents our history. So in our work, we are asking ourselves who and what are deemed important, whose voices are we hearing, and more importantly, whose are we leaving out? And yet, worldwide, places of memory can tell us who we are and give us the opportunity to decide who we want to become. We have seen powerful examples, such as this one of the AIDS Memorial Quilt, of memorial spaces that support healing and drive movements of change. We established the Public Memory and Memorials Lab to research and design around a central thesis that spatializing memory can support healing and inspire collective action for generations to come. Across our 5 design studios at MASS, we've supported more than 40 partners working to rethink memory and memorialization. National urgency, particularly in the States, has driven a concentration of projects centered on the impacts of racial terror in America. However, our broader portfolio demonstrates how our stories and collective memory intersect across identities and boundaries. Over the past 5 years in the lab, we've prioritized these kind of 5 hypotheses, the first being that choosing projects that center intersectional narratives and lived experience is critical because we believe that holistic, human-centered histories are the most resonant and the best suited to improve our shared understanding of the futures we want to build together. Second, working deliberately across typologies to create learning journeys that captivate, transform, and call people to action is imperative to our work. Responding to each project's unique needs, not going in with the same solution, but actually going in with an open mind, offering facilitation, research, documentation, and advocacy to complement the ultimate design work. Fourth, valuing how public memory work can be impactful regardless of the project's size or format, so thinking about the scale of memorialization. And lastly, something that I've heard Jermaine say several times this weekend relates to how acknowledging that the work of commemoration often means reckoning with collective and personal trauma, requiring care and patience to avoid committing this trauma and reproducing this harm. And so we invest, especially through our philanthropic support, the necessary time to borrow and build trust, understand the context in which we're working, and facilitate generative dialogue. And so we are very devoted to taking time in this work. As I mentioned before, I'll share very briefly a little bit about the Abundant Futures Lab that has recently been launched at Mass. And this lab was launched in order to invest more into the climate and nature initiatives that many of our Mass projects have already demonstrated are possible, but it does require this body of work that has dedicated resources and research in order to better articulate it. We all in this room know that design is never neutral. It either hurts or heals. We know that there are some statistics that say that architecture and the built environment produce 30% of waste, 40% of greenhouse gases, and consumes 50% of all materials. And so we work with great leaders to help them test radical ideas, and when these radical ideas work, we leverage those stories to shift policy, move markets, and ultimately change behavior. Climate and nature solutions have been inherent in our work over the past 15 years that Mass has existed. We listen to indigenous wisdoms and global expertise to deliver lighthouse projects that create transformative change. To focus this talk today, I wanted to draw this brief connection, which is that while environmental injustice is often presented as a snapshot of current conditions, in reality it is actually a function of time, the result of compounded decisions about place and people. Understanding histories of the built environment is essential to pursuing environmental justice. Memory in public is paramount. So now I want to shift us into some project work. I have 3 projects to share with you all, as I mentioned before. This is perhaps the fastest I have ever presented these projects. So if you have questions, I will not be surprised because you are not getting all of the information on today. But we're gonna do this because I respect your time and I really wanna hear from the fellows. So let's get it. So this project here is in Sugar Land, Texas. Sugar Land is about 30 minutes southwest of Houston, Texas. And here we're working on a memorial cemetery to honor the 95 victims of convict leasing whose remains were discovered during the construction of a public school. When completed, the site will invite the public to learn about a piece of American history that is not often taught. The convict leasing program in the state existed from roughly 1867 to early 1900s, 1910. And today, much of that history has been erased from the surprisingly diverse and very wealthy suburb. And so this discovery of these remains has brought about insight on the dark past of the county, state, and nation. But more importantly, it has provided the school district with an opportunity to educate the community and students about this part of history that has been just completely left out of our textbooks. Convict leasing, or the leasing of forced labor from incarcerated individuals for corporate gain, was rampant across the state and the country. and part of a larger trajectory of slavery to current-day mass incarceration. So there's a definite connection between slavery and current-day mass incarceration in our country, and sharecropping and convict leasing are very much part of that. This project is a significant opportunity for us to recognize the victims of convict leasing with dignity and honor, but it's also an opportunity to be a catalytic change in how we as a society, as a country, memorialize mass graves and historic cemeteries. And so there are a number of these mass graves and historic cemeteries that are being unearthed, rediscovered, refound, acknowledged, and this project is one of the first that is sort of having this national memorial recognition. The Sugar Land 95 Cemetery's adjacency to this high school that was indeed built after the discovery is a unique opportunity to tell the truth about systemic racism in a way that cannot be ignored. In response to the discovery, a whole wing of the building was removed from the floor plans, and after the completion of the construction process, the remains of the 95 individuals were reinterred on the site and designated as a historical cemetery in 2021. And so let me get this cursor together. So there is actually supposed to be another wing of the building here, and they removed it from the floor plans, reinterred the remains on the lighter green space that you're, nope, whoop, what did I do? Okay, and we're back. Reinterred, I'm not gonna use that pointer no more. You told me it was good, Matthias, you lied. But reinterred the remains back there on that site, and it is now, as I said before, a historic cemetery. Oh, it was me, okay, I'm gonna just stand over here. Okay, so throughout our engagement with local residents, we heard that the cemetery should be a place for reflection, but also it should be a place for celebration. And that led us, our team, to be inspired by a traditional homegoing. Some believed that death meant freedom for those who were enslaved or victims of forced labor. But the Sugar Land 95 were not afforded the dignity of a homegoing, so we knew that the site needed to become a celebration of freedom from oppression, injustices, and suffering, and so we referenced the 5 stages of a homegoing. The first of those is, and you'll see these through a few conceptual sketches, the first of those is awake, which is the acceptance of loss, a personal moment with the deceased. Next is the service, a jubilant remembrance of the deceased and emotional expressions through song, dance, and shouting. The procession, which is third, represents the participants going together to bury their loved one at their final resting place. It's also a moment to exchange stories. And ultimately, the repast is the feast and fellowship that follows the burial. And so we mapped our site plan based off of these stages of a homegoing, very much thinking about the Sugar Land 95, who never had such a proper homegoing or burial. These next few slides just show you all some conceptual renderings of where we are in the process. And so interpretive signage will educate the public about convict leasing and its effects, both historic and certainly ongoing. And 95 markers, which have not yet been designed, so please do not critique those over there on the right-hand side, will remind visitors that they're standing at a mass grave. And part of the reason why we've not yet articulated the design for the markers is because we are still waiting for DNA testing results to be able to identify more descendants so that we can design the markers with them. And so for now, we've been showing in all of our fundraising documents these placeholder markers so that it's very clear that they are coming. Outdoor classrooms will offer space for groups to gather, witness, and pay homage to the deceased. And finally, a memorial pavilion will host community events and support experiential learning for students, local residents, and visitors alike. I told y'all this was going to be the fastest through projects I've ever done, so I'm going to move you all to the second set of projects that I wanted to share with you all today. And so I'm pivoting now to a pair of projects that we're working on in Alabama. And we have an opportunity to be working both in Selma, Alabama, as well as Montgomery, Alabama, to honor the historic 1965 Voting Rights March, which took place between March 21st and 25th in 1965, involved roughly 25,000 people total, and eventually resulted in the legal right for Black Americans to vote in our country. So that is in my mother's lifetime that I, as a Black person, was legally allowed to vote in my home country. There are many stories, markers, events, people, and places that are part of the story of the Voting Rights March, and we are hoping that these 2 projects commemorating the beginning and the end of the march can begin to tie these many narratives together. One through line is this notion of radical hospitality. That is something that is reoccurring in these two projects. And it is because the march was made possible by a network of public housing residents in Selma and Black landowners along the march route, this 54-mile route, whose control of land actually enabled this policy-changing demonstration, which was a landmark assertion of celebration of political agency. So had it not been for these public housing residents being able to house folks, and it not been for these landowners, the Voting Rights March Act would probably not be what we know it to be today. So in Selma, specifically, we are working with an organization called Foot Soldiers Park, which is led by Miss Joanne Bland, who was one of the youngest marchers to participate in the 1965 march. And the mission of the park is to honor the individuals who marched 54 miles, or the equivalent of 87 kilometers, from Selma to Montgomery as part of the 5-day march. The goal is also, the mission of the organization is also to bring economic and cultural revitalization to the city of Selma. If you have ever visited Selma, it is certainly one of the most forgotten places in our country, and it is actually enraging to understand that this city was so instrumental to such critical moments in our civil rights history, and yet it is completely ignored and forgotten. And so the next thing that they want to do is prepare the next generation of activists to continue the fight against racial injustice and voter suppression. So our team at Mass, we are working specifically on the memorial portion, but we are part of a larger, broader landscape and architecture team for the full park. So these photos here show marchers, and I don't know how well y'all can see the image, but this is the George Washington Carver home housing project, and this is a basketball court. This is Brown Chapel that's here on the corner. And so several of these photos show the marchers gathering there at the George Washington Carver homes. And as I mentioned before, many of these residents, including Miss Joanne Bland and her mother, opened their hearts and homes to the marchers and activists from across the country who were housed and fed there because they could not stay anywhere else in segregated Selma. So we worked with a committee of Selma residents, marchers, and historians of the civil rights movement with whom we developed a 5-stage visitor journey that will bring visitors alongside the historic foot soldiers as they organized to begin the march in Selma and persevered through intense, violent repression to do so. I imagine that a number of you in this room have seen some of the horrific photos of Bloody Sunday where these marchers were turned back over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with just a overwhelming amount of violence and neglect for human life. And to frame this journey, we developed the concept of the wave. It is representing the incredible collective fortitude of the foot soldiers as they attempted this march, not once, but actually 3 times. They had to start the march 3 times before it was successful. And as the waves rise out of the ground, it demonstrates how individuals came together to demand their rights, rising above the fear of danger and persecution. At the top of the 3rd wave, the visitor is elevated to a different vantage point where they can make connections to the George Washington Carver homes as well as Brown Chapel where the march began, as well as the route that the foot soldiers took down MLK Street, all while being called to reflect on how they'll protect voters' rights today. And in Montgomery, I told you we're doing the beginning and the end of the march. In Montgomery, we are working at the final campsite for the Voting Rights March of 1965 on a project that will serve as a gateway into Montgomery and reinvest in the historic neighborhood of West Montgomery that was home to many of the marchers. On March 24th, 1965, the marchers reached the grounds of a Catholic social services campus called the City of St. Jude in the West Montgomery neighborhood, and this was the final campsite before the arrival at the State House the following morning. In addition to the interpretive center that is currently on St. Jude's campus, the City of Montgomery, who is our client in this case, has the opportunity to redevelop an adjacent parcel that could amplify the site's historic significance while also reinvesting in the community. The City of St. Jude was home to the first integrated hospital in the South and welcomed over 2,000 people to camp on the evening of March 24th. A concert was organized called the Stars of Freedom Rally, which showcased performances by Nina Simone, Harry Belafonte, Pete Seeger, Leonard Bernstein, and Joan Baez. This historic moment was one of incredible joy and celebration, which is central to being able to remember this demonstration of political agency. And so we're constantly looking for ways to reflect on and center joy, particularly Black joy, in our work. Part of investing in this neighborhood is about addressing harmful planning decisions that were made in the 1960s. The neighborhood's disinvestment is tied to the construction of the interstate system, where the built environment was used as a weapon of systemic devaluation. This project is an opportunity to build and reconnect the neighborhood fabric for healing, restoration, and ultimately vibrancy. What we've proposed for this project is a phased redevelopment that leverages public investment in anchor institutions and housing that complements and amplifies the historic site next door. We're focused on a strategy of using public memory as a catalyst for equitable development. And I am going to share one more project with you all very quickly before we open up for questions. The final project that I want to share brings us to northern Rwanda, where Mass has had the incredible experience of working with the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund to not only design a new purpose-built campus, but also to build it with our Rwandan-based Mass Build team and to engage in a robust impact study alongside the Fossey Fund organization. In 2017, we were approached by the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund to help them realize a new campus that met their long-term needs. Today, the Fossey Fund is an international and largely African organization working 365 days a year to achieve their mission of saving gorillas and conservation work that is embedded within communities. The mountain gorilla population is currently endangered, estimated at just over 1,000 living in the wild in a unique ecosystem on the border of Rwanda, Uganda, and the Congo. A few years ago, the population went from critically endangered to endangered, a great conservation success story. Despite their expanding number, though, their success is still fragile. Gorillas are resilient animals, but poaching, habitat destruction, disease, and human pressure on their forest home continue to threaten their existence. When we first met the Fossey Fund team, they had outgrown their rented facilities, which no longer met their needs. And so part of this investment in a new home for the Fossey Fund was to honor the Rwandan-led research to counter a history of knowledge extraction. Many research papers published about Rwanda are written by Westerners for a Western audience. And so the goal here was to support research in Rwanda by Rwandans. To meet the conservation challenges of the future, we definitely need highly trained African conservationists. And as we began designing for the Fossey Fund's new home, we asked, how can the campus make gorillas an entry point for a lifetime of conservation activism for Rwandans and visitors alike? And so I'm going to move us along here just for a moment because I want to make sure that I have time to talk to you all a bit about some of the impact metric measuring that we were able to do with this project. And if you have specific questions about the design, I can come back to that in a moment. And so throughout construction, we used an impact framework to guide and track our work together. And this is why I wanted to share this particular project, given the theme of this year's Walk and Talk. So the framework enabled us to prioritize our impact goals and assess how the construction of the campus created tangible improvements in people's lives along 5 domains. Those 5 domains are economy, education, environment, equity, and emotion. Mass worked with the Fossey Fund to provide monthly reporting. And so for economy, local hiring was prioritized with 98% of the labor for the project coming from within the Musanze district. All of the campus furniture was designed by Mass Made and made in Rwanda by 85+ artisans and design cooperatives. For education, 32% of workers had never worked on a site before, 92% had less than 3 years of experience. So we partnered with German Corporation and a local polytechnic regional college to deliver theoretical and practical training that could prepare workers for roles in steel fixing, carpentry, masonry, green roofing, and other in-demand trades. Certification was provided to nearly 600 workers as a result of the training program. For equity, the site employed twice the proportion of women than is typical on Rwandan construction sites, in addition to the Mass Women's Group that was set up as a space for women to help, teach, and empower each other. And as part of the commitment to regeneration of the land, nearly 300,000 plants were planted and nearly 200,000 native plants were propagated, created a reforestation research site that is informing efforts to expand Volcanoes National Park. Last slide here, I will skip to this one. In many different ways, I will say that these projects demonstrate how much process matters. That is a very important way to our work. We are always thinking about not just the design, but the design process and the people and the place that is involved in those projects. And it's also worth underscoring how history and memory have an important role in how we approach work in the built environment, be it a formal memorial or not. So as we move into Q&A, I hope that I have piqued your curiosities enough about Mass Design Group, and I want to bring us back to the poem that I opened with and simply ask you all, what are we deciding? Thank you.
Questions, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm familiar with mass design, and we had the opportunity to visit the Dian Fossey campus in Rwanda. But a question I always come back to in terms of mass is your fundraising model. Like being a nonprofit in architecture obviously affords you certain opportunities, and I'm curious to understand how you navigate that philanthropy landscape to bring this architecture into reality, and yeah, maybe just speak to that a little generally.
Yeah, so you want my philanthropy team here, not me. No. I was actually talking a little bit about this last night at dinner, and I do want to clarify that while we are a nonprofit business model in the States, we do technically function very much like a typical architecture firm. We do have projects that are for fee, so not our entire organization is solely supported by philanthropy. However, we do leverage philanthropy in some of the ways that I shared earlier to help support us in some of the early visioning stages of work that we do, some of the accompaniment, some of the immersion, some of the impact tracking that currently our field of design and architecture does not fund, does not, for whatever reason, consider to be critical to the work of contributing to the built environment. And so we are able to identify different philanthropy options through grants, through private funders, and other such resources that allows our teams, not just the Boston studio that I represent, but our studio in Poughkeepsie, New York, our studio in Santa Fe, New Mexico, our team in Kigali, as well as our broader landscape studio that touches all of those geographic locations. We are able to leverage these funds in a way that allows us to support the work that is most meaningful to us. And in doing so, especially in the lab, at least from the perspective of the Public Memory and Memorials Lab, a lot of that funding is catalyst for our project partners to then be able to go out and raise the capital that is necessary for their projects. So a lot of times we're investing in the very early visioning stages of a project, using some of that philanthropic support, helping our project partner to identify their mission, the vision of the project, and then they are using those materials to then go out, raise the capital for the project, and then come back into what are the more traditional, typical, expected phases of architecture. And I'm pretty sure there's somewhere on our website that breaks those numbers down if you want the specifics.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. It was a really inspiring talk. I wanted to know if you also measure the impact after you're out of the site. So what happens to all these installed transfers of knowledge that you make?
So the Fossey Fund project is one example of us really being able to start this investment process in impact tracking. There are other examples of projects that have also done a fairly robust job of doing so. For the Public Memory and Memorials Lab specifically, that is something that we've identified in our strategic visioning for the next year, is really this opportunity to understand how has this memorial work, how has this engagement, how has this collective articulation of the importance of memory impacted the communities beyond that. And so we don't yet have the metrics for that, but we're in the process of developing the tools with our project partners to be able to understand, beyond the realm of design and architecture, which we all could articulate, how does a project like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice truly catalyze a community beyond inspiring the enormous amount of memorials that we've started to see pop up in the United States. And so it's something that we're focused on, so ask me that question again in about 2 years. I got you.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk. I wonder, we learned this morning about this site, and I wonder how you would process, or would be the process about this political, so interesting and conflict side. How you would, how would be the process?
That is a great question, because our processes per project change, right? They have to be slightly unique, but I think one place that we would definitely start, particularly on a site like this, is a very long, intentional, deliberate journey of listening and storytelling, because even just in the tours that I've had, I'm understanding that different communities have a different perspective of this site. And so if we're going to embark on a memorial process at a site like this, we have to understand how each community is defining memory, what time frame of memory, what level of memory, and how do we make space actually for those layers, right? Because in our process, we don't want to perpetuate the erasure that we've all been subjected to, but instead we want to be able to make space for an abundance of histories that can overlap, that can be intertwined. And so for a process like this, for a place like this, we would definitely start with likely like a 6 to 9 month listening and learning journey through the lens of storytelling and multimedia. You're welcome.
Hey, Jadi.
Hi.
Spoken word.
I had to do it. Y'all know this is the first time I've ever opened a talk with a poem in 6 years? 16 years, however long it's been.
That was beautiful and powerful. Of course, as Malika mentioned, we're quite familiar with Mass and we're collaborators. But I think for the sake of everyone else here, can you speak a little bit about the structure at Mass and what's led a kind of radically new approach to architecture to then subdivide into labs, and what the purpose of a lab is and how your own lab is structured?
Sure. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation here, the labs really are an opportunity for us to have focused energy around a particular topic area. So while the whole collection of Mass, and as I mentioned before, we're 5 studios. So 4 of those studios are geographic, and the 5th is our landscape studio that covers all of those geographic locations. And so there's a studio in Boston, Poughkeepsie, New York, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Kigali, Rwanda, and then there's our landscape studio. And we collectively are focused on architecture through the lens of social justice. And so that allows us to work on a number of type of projects, different typologies, hospitals, education centers, housing, and et cetera. But the labs actually provide us with an opportunity to focus and concentrate some energy on a particular topic. And so, for example, the Disability Justice Lab that we have really allows one of my colleagues, Jeff Mansfield, who is a deaf individual practicing architect, to have the resources and the funding to focus primarily on deaf and disability justice architecture and design. And so he has the freedoms, if you will, to research and engage in projects or project partners that might not necessarily yet have the funding to provide a full architectural service entity, because we all know that we're working for a fee, and we got to figure out where the money's coming from to keep the doors open and to pay people and et cetera. And so with these labs, we're actually able to focus and concentrate the resources to do this level of deep involvement and deep investigation. And so the labs are structured in such a way that they are not studio specific. So the Public Memory and Memorials Lab, although I'm based in Boston, it is not only Boston, US work. Our French Cities Lab, although it is mostly rooted in Poughkeepsie because it's a concentration on proximity, a lot of the lessons that we're learning there can be applied to our work across the board, and so forth and so on. And so we're intentionally learning from these labs and figuring out a way to then disperse that information and that learning back to our broader architecture process. I hope that answers the question. No, Jermaine does not get to ask the question.
Jermaine gets to ask
Adam,
one question.
Seriously, come on. It's Jermaine's fault I'm here. Don't give him the mic. Huh.
Too late.
What do you want?
I just wanted to say one thank you,
You're welcome.
but
Can you talk a bit about the way that you present, and more specifically, your commitment to, as you mentioned, being whole, because you don't want to give us pieces of you?
Yes. I really do not like this question because the way that I present has evolved, and I'm getting back to the way that I present. But one of the things is that I've always been very mindful of trying to be as present as possible with folks and using language that you said your grandmother earlier, but I claim my mother, that my mother would understand, because it's important for me that we're able to be in dialogue. I do not ever want to talk at you. I want to talk with you. I want to talk amongst you. I want to learn from you. And I feel that it's very important to communicate information in a way that people want to receive it, want to hold on to it, and want to give me something back. And so that has been a very important part of my presentation style. But since the pandemic and not speaking or performing for so long in front of folks, and then also since having Ezra, I still have not gotten rid of my mommy brain. And so I find myself behind a script and behind a screen more often than I'd like. But nonetheless, I still feel present, and I decided today to open with a poem, which is something that I've never done before, as I just said to Stephen, because I felt like this was a learning space. I felt like the way that you, Jermaine, and Tatiana described this experience, it felt to me like this was a place where that would be welcomed, where that would be received, and where we could actually start to have a transformative conversation. Also, speaking of rolling in graves and et cetera from last night's dinner, I just wanted to roll some graves by performing this righteous ass poem in this space. But also I wanted to ground myself, and that's a very important part of me being a speaker and a performer, is I want to remain grounded so that I can remain whole, because I can't engage with you, I can't answer your questions, I can't impart knowledge, I can't receive knowledge if I am being something other than what my mama told me to be. So I try to embody all of that in my presentation styles.